All right, Captain Dan Hanley, thank you so much for being on the show, mate. I really appreciate that you were so quick to respond to my email coming through to be on the show, which is really impressive. I was
Yeah.
amused to send that email because like my morning routine is to sort of head to the cafe and read a book and listen to a podcast and have a coffee before the day gets going. And so I'm always scouring the internet for inspirational people, people that I want to talk to and find more information. And in the event of like 9/11 has just sort of come past, right? In terms of the historical date of 9/11. And I was speaking to a mate of mine. He sent me a video that was all about whether it was a planned attack, and there was some information around that. And I said to him, I'd really love to interview someone about this because it's a widely known topic. There's many conspiracies, there's many facts, there's many theories, and he sent me you. And so I was sitting in the cafe and I got onto Twitter, found your email and your website, went through to email you, and then I got a phone call like half an hour later. So I was just like shocked. I keep telling people the same story all the time. I was like, I can't believe this guy
Yeah.
called me at bloody, 8 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on the program, Adrian. I appreciate it. And you said conspiracy theories and conspiracy facts. I want to present a series of conspiracy facts to listeners and let them draw their own conclusions regarding what I'm going to talk about. So,
Yeah, that'd be good. Well, look,
yeah, we're
let's
not,
start from the beginning because I mean I've
okay.
only just discovered you, and I think most of the people that might be listening to this may or may not know you. I don't know, so maybe we can start from the beginning because I'd love to know a bit more about your background,
Yeah.
in terms of your flight experience and all those sorts of things. But then also, if you wouldn't mind, anyway, let's just start with there. So give me a bit of a history on your background and how you sort of come to be in this sort of present day.
Okay. I was a pilot my whole life and I wanted to be an airline pilot since I was a little kid. And I got my dream come true at age 19 in 1968. That was 56 years ago. I'll save you the math. I'm 75 now, but I commenced flying as a civilian. And over a 2-year period, I got my private commercial instrument model, the engine rating, went on to college. And when I was getting out, the Vietnam War was raging, so I had to make service plans. So I chose naval aviation and flew 4 different Navy aircraft and got hired by United Airlines in 1978 as a pilot. And over the course of the next 25 years, I flew 6 different commercial jet aircraft. So all total over a 35-year career span, I flew 15 different aircraft, accruing 20,000 flight hours. But it all ended tragically for me in 2003 when I was illegally grounded by United Airlines and the FAA for speaking out on issues concerning 9/11. And that incident practically ruined my life because it over a couple of year period as a whistleblower, it destroyed a 27-year marriage, which alienated my 2 kids, who blamed me for the divorce. Still believe the official 9/11 story. Think I'm a whacked out conspiracy nut and don't talk to me.
Wow.
I lost $4 million in pay, pension, and stock, and it destroyed a 35-year career in aviation and ruined my reputation as a pilot. So that was the
Wow.
price I paid for speaking the truth. But getting back to the story, there are uh, I contend that the Muslim hijackers were not qualified to fly the aircraft on 9/11, and they were too inexperienced to fly the profiles. And there's 300,000 pilots in the world, and I believe most, if not all of them, would agree with my assertion, except we
Mm.
have nowhere to go with this information. Now, if you go back to the 9/11 Commission, there was a executive director named Philip Zelikow, and I'll talk to you a bit later about how he suppressed information, critical information, but he prevented any pilot from testifying before the 9/11 Commission as to the absurdity of this ludicrous notion that these hijackers actually piloted the aircraft.
Mm.
Now, because of this, a group of, I guess I spearheaded the effort, but a group of pilots got together realizing this and decided we were going to create a global grassroots effort called 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers. And we created a website at 911pilots.org, and we've got a YouTube channel at 911 Pilots. And we apologize, but there's a Join Us tab at the top of the page on the website that isn't working right now, but we got our webmaster working on that. But once we get that up, if you want to join our crusade here, all we need is your name and email address, and we'll put you on our mailing list. But the purpose of our organization, fasten your seatbelts here, because some of you will say he's a conspiracy nut and tune this out here, but let me finish what I have to say. But the purpose of our organization is to show that there were no Muslim hijackers controlling the 9/11 aircraft, but that the aircraft were electronically hijacked and remotely controlled through employment of a system called the uninterruptible autopilot that enables a remote source to take complete control of the aircraft autopilot and flight management computer on the aircraft and guide it to its selected target, whether that's a building or another airport or somewhere else to be destroyed. So before I go any further, once the system is engaged, the pilots can't disconnect it. They're along for the ride. Now, before I go any further, there will be people who actually believe that holograms and CGI was employed to give the simulation of an airplane hitting the tower, and there's other people who believe a cruise missile hit the Pentagon. Well, 9/11 Pilot Whistleblowers doesn't even go there. We don't even address those two issues. But we do ask the question, if that were the case, what happened to the airplanes with crew and passengers on board? And we contend in that instance that they were electronically hijacked. The airplane wasn't flown somewhere else. So one of our goals has been to recruit highly trained and experienced pilots from around the world who will attest on video, and we have this on our website on the drop-down menu under pilot interviews, but they've attested on video, and we put it on YouTube and social media as to the absurdity that these pilots flew the aircraft, and they give the reasons why. Now, we've only got 10 interviews on our website because pilots were mainly saying the same thing over and over again, and YouTube was taking them down, if you can imagine, for hate speech. These simple interviews that we were, So,
Dan, can I just back you up a little bit? So you've mentioned so much information in such a short period of time. So just for my mind, especially because I wouldn't mind just sort of winding things back a little bit further to the actual event, because I guess what I hear is your reasoning as to what happened based on your knowledge as a captain, as a pilot, and your 20 plus years experience, right? So I get all that and I hear it, but I wouldn't mind maybe just recollecting some of the sort of I guess the facts of the day as it was turning out, because like my memory is a little vague of the actual event in happening, but I remember being a 20-something-year-old man and listening to the radio and watching the news and having this event go on, and just being in absolute shock and like horror of what was happening. Right, I was in disbelief that anything like this in my lifetime would happen. So for me personally, it was something that I didn't discredit any part of it at that point. You know, it's almost like there was nothing in me that was saying there's something wrong about this scene or these actions that are going on with Tower 1 and you know, Building 1 and Building 2 and Tower 7 and then the Pentagon and all those sorts of things. It just seemed like it was all happening so fast. And for me, it was just a very surreal moment. But like, what was it like for you in the throes of all of that? Like, you would have been well into your pilot career. You would have been involved in sort of like the inside knowledge as to, you know, what was going on from a, you know, airspace perspective. I don't know how to sort of put the wording, but I wouldn't mind getting your perspective on like what was going through your mind at the moment that the event happened.
Well, I believed it like you did. I was
Really?
at Newark that day and saw the planes burning, I mean, the tires burning. And I was supposed to go to London that night. That was canceled, obviously. But to me, it was a very black moment looking at those tires smoking. I thought all I could think was pure evil. Okay. And I went along with the story until I got out on the line and started flying and saw all the holes in the security system. And I thought, wait a minute, this can't be possible. And I had flight attendants coming to me saying, you got to say something. We're sitting ducks back here because they'd made all these promises about cameras in the back of the aircraft, secondary barrier protection, federal air marshals, et cetera, et cetera. And they weren't following through on any of the promises. So when I went to the company, the union and lower level management, and I was real senior at the time, like number 100 out of 10,000 pilots. So I knew all the senior people in management in the union. And I said, hey, I've got all these flight attendants out here that are afraid, and some pilots as well, and nobody's doing anything. And they said, keep your head down. These guys are nasty. If you take it to the next level, you're going to get hurt.
Right.
And they said, what? So I proceeded to file reports internal within the company and sending letters in. And I sent one letter to the vice president of operations for the airline. And I got a call from my chief pilot who said to me, Dan, Ed Soliday called me today and said, is Hanley one of yours? And I said, yeah. And he said, you tell that son of a bitch that effective Monday morning, if he thinks he can do a better job, he can be vice president of operations. And I went, what kind
Oh,
of an
wow.
answer is that?
So
Right.
what were
So
some of the things that you were saying in the letters? What were you bringing to their
just
attention?
just that, well, an example was 90% of the luggage going in, cargo going into the belly of the aircraft wasn't being expected. There were other things that they couldn't do anything about, like shoulder-launched infrared heat-seeking missiles that could take an airplane down anyhow. And I thought, wait a minute, there's all these other threats out here, and they're not addressing them at all. And I was skeptical only because I knew the bean counters were counting their stock options in the head office, right? And they could give two hoots about us out in the trenches dealing with all these situations. So I made the mistake because I was naive at the time, didn't realize how corrupt the government was. I pressed forward with this issue and started sending these letters in and decided because I was going out on a limb that I needed to protect myself. So I established a correspondence trail a mile long, both with emails and letters, and even recorded phone conversations and had witnesses that were backing me up with what I'm doing. And I got feedback from the lower level manager was the management, upper level management thinks you're a big mouth, loose cannon whistleblower, and they want you to go away. Well, I thought, well, that's not a good answer either. So
Yeah.
long story short, because I've done hour-long programs just describing the situation. So I'll cut to the chase here. I was going to write a letter to the CEO of United Airlines, and I sent it. I called my union boss in New York and said, Mark, I'm going to send this letter. And he goes, don't do it until I run it by the union lawyers, I said, I'm not going to sit on this forever because this has been going on and I'm getting stonewalled. Now, mind you, United Airlines was in bankruptcy at the time and the unions were on the ropes about to go face down on the canvas. So they were kind of powerless in this regard. So I waited a couple of days and I was over at the JFK food court in New York and I get a call right in the middle of a bunch of people on my cell phone. And it was the senior lawyer for the union and the grievance committee chairman had me on speakerphone in Chicago. And I said, Bob, did you read my letter? And he goes, yes. I go, do you agree with the content? He says, yes. And I was basically saying that because the company was in bankruptcy, the union was powerless to represent my interests here. And I said, well, you're my union attorney. What do you recommend? And he said, don't send the letter in. I said, well, why? What are they going to do? And the grievance committee chairman said, go ahead and send that letter in if you never want to fly a United airplane again in your life. So
Wow.
I said, what are they going to do? And they said, they'll find, we've seen it happen. And I had too. He says, we've seen it happen before. If they can't get you professionally, medically, they'll take you down psychologically. So
Right.
back up a bit. I had seen this happen, so I sought the advice and counsel of the best mental health professionals in Atlanta, where I lived at the time, that I could, and said, hey, here's this mess I'm in with United. I think they're going to try to take me out. I'll come for counseling, take testing, whatever it takes to prove I'm mentally stable, which they did. So I had these witness, the correspondence trail, these reports that I'd filed internally with the company, everything. And I thought, I'm going to expose this system, not realizing how corrupt everything was. So uh,
Yeah.
rather than send in the letter, I sent in a series of reports online called Flight Safety Awareness Reports that brought the FAA into the equation here. And as soon the day I did that, the next morning I get a call from my assistant chief pilot and said, "You've been taken out of schedule. Uh, you've got to come to New York to talk to us before you can fly another flight." I said, "I haven't done anything wrong. And what are you doing with these reports? They're supposed to be filed in confidentiality with impunity." And he said, "I'm giving you an order to come up here." Well, the union lawyers had told, I'd asked them, "How far in are you going to follow me on this?" And they said, "Not very far." So I was out on a limb, exposed to a bunch of big people in the company. And I said, "Well, I've got to bring in my own attorney." And they refused. I said, "Well, then we're at an impasse. I can't come up and expose myself to the possibility of being terminated here." And we hung up with that. Well, time goes by, and I was busy trying to talk with company lawyers and the union lawyers and my council chairman in New York, saying, "We got to resolve this. We got to come to some kind of a compromise." But before we were able to, uh, I was called by my chief pilot and said, "Dan, I ran into the chief flight surgeon in Denver, and he asked, is Hanley one of yours?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Put the son of a bitch on sick list." That was his exact words. So
Wow.
I said to my chief pilot, "I haven't done anything to deserve this. I haven't seen an aeromedical professional." He said, "I'm sorry, my hands are tied on this." So uh, he again, I was even talking to company attorneys saying, "Come on, there's got to be some kind of a compromise on this situation here." And they wouldn't budge on that. "Well, you only have so much sick list on the book." And I was going to go non-pay. And I called my chief pilot and I go, "This is punitive now, Bob." And he goes, "Well, what you can do is submit to the employee assistance program. It's endorsed by the FAA, the company, and the union. It guarantees your pay comes in. All you have to do is go up and see an aeromedical doctor in Chicago. We'll fly you up there first class." So I thought, well, I've got all this evidence. I'll do that. I knew this was coming. So I went up there, go over and see this aeromedical surgeon, and he said to me, have you seen uh, a mental health professional?" I said, "Yeah, you want to talk to him?" And I opened my phone and called my psychiatrist in Atlanta, and they were talking on the phone. Well, long story short, to go any further, but they wound up, I wound up going over and seeing a psychiatrist and talking to him briefly, and they said, "We're going to diagnose you as bipolar." Well, I knew that's the weapon of choice in this
Right.
instance, okay? And I
Right.
said,
So
"Well,
just to interject, so this obviously puts you on the map of someone they've got to get rid of because you're making too much noise. So
exactly."
with while this is going on, like what are some of the things that you really wanted to get out there in order to make it like you wanted to make this public knowledge, or you wanted to get the airlines to sort of like right some of the wrongs that you think that they might have been doing? What was your motive behind sort of speaking out at that time?
Well, I wanted to keep it internal to the company because the company was in bankruptcy, and I didn't want to have a big scandal or controversy. So at this point in time, I wanted to expose what they were doing to me because I'd seen this over the decades happening. And we've got an organization we're establishing now called the Whistleblowing Airline Pilots Association that we're going to expose this method of terminating pilots. But that was my intent. And they got me off the property. And I it wasn't until the government announced the lack of experience in the training that these hijackers had. I go, "This story is garbage." Okay, because I'd flown the Cessna airplanes that I had trained in the late 60s. And I also flew the 757 and 767 aircraft. I knew it was totally impossible. So I knew they were lying through their teeth about what was happening. And that's what sent me down the path to where I am today.
Wow.
That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. The in with respect to 9/11 and the moments that were following all of that, what were some of the things that were going through your mind that didn't make any sense in the sort of aftermath of watching it all play out? Because you said a minute ago, like you were like me, you thought this was a legit thing. You probably were like every patriotic American that just wanted to, you know, get these guys and go to war and all that kind of stuff. But there must have been a few things that were going through your mind that started to maybe, I guess, give you the idea that there was more to this story than what they were portraying on the news, right? So what were some of those
Right.
things?
Well, actually, the 9/11 truth movement in my mind didn't kick off till 2006. And this happened to me in 2003. And I wound up
Right.
going back to college because here I was, 54 years of age, unemployed, with only marketable skill was flying airplanes, and I wasn't going to do that again in my life. So I took kind of a sabbatical there for a brief period of time. And it wasn't until 2006 that I found out another pilot named Captain Field McConnell. They were trying to ground him. They were trying to force him to see a psychiatrist in LA because they were going to ground him because he was exposing these illegal modifications on Boeing aircraft, the uninterruptible autopilot. So
Mhm.
that was my aha moment. When I discovered that the system existed, it was like, so that's how they did it. Okay, now I got it. Now that sent me off on a tangent because there's more to the story I won't bore you with because I was involved with trying to expose judicial corruption in the United bankruptcy. The judge we allege was mobbed up. So there's other things I was doing at the time, but that's what I actually established another grassroots organization called the Whistleblowing Airline Employees Association. And I had a blog talk radio program, a website, a blog, and all this. And I was interviewing employees, not just pilots, but flight attendants, mechanics, air traffic controllers, federal air marshals, et cetera, who were coming forth with their own stories. So that's how it all unfolded for me, was
Mm.
listening to these other people talk and realize that the government had to have been in on this because they were stifling, suppressing anybody that came forward, labeling them a conspiracy nut, which they still do today.
Yeah, for sure. So did you know anyone that was wanting to testify at that time, or was there sort of people coming to you knowing that you were a whistleblower and you were sort of speaking out against this? Is that kind of how a lot of this sort of backstory come together for you?
Right. I had an email list that I put out information on, and that's how the people came to me to get on these radio. I mean, the radio program that I had.
Yeah,
Uh, but they're all reluctant to come forward because they'll get fired.
of course.
The
Yeah,
system that used to terminate me, they know about it and they're afraid of getting fired, so they're reluctant to come forward.
got it.
As a matter of fact, I said there's 300,000 pilots in the world. Even if there was another 9/11 commission, I believe that very few would step forward because they're afraid they're going to get whacked. So,
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, I mean, still to this day, people go missing when they when they speak out about certain things like this. So you're definitely putting your
yeah.
head on the chopping block. So can you talk to me more about this automated pilot system and how it correlates to the hijackers of the planes? Like, why doesn't it make sense to you that these particular um, pilots could have had the ability to fly these planes into the buildings?
Okay, well, let me give you a brief history of the evolution of remote control aircraft, and then I'll get into a specific hijacker, Hani Hanjour, and why we believe the system was used. Now, most people will be challenged to believe that the remote control of large airplanes goes back 80 years toward the end of the World War II in 1944 in the UK. the U.S. Army Air Corps launched Operation Aphrodite, where they gutted out old B-17 airplanes. They did it to lighten the weight of the aircraft so they could load it with 30,000 pounds of Torpex, which was a highly incendiary compound. Now, pilots were required to make the takeoff, but once they got airborne, they bailed out of the aircraft, and these airplanes were remotely guided into targets in Europe. And this was 80 years ago, this was happening. And we mentioned on our website that Joe Kennedy, JFK's older brother, was killed on one of these top secret missions when the airplane blew up due to a malfunction before he had a chance to bail out of the aircraft. So that's one instance, and I could cite several, but I won't because it would take too long a period of time. But we could jump to 1962, where and you imagine the technology advancements with the evolution of the computer. 1962, the U.S. wanted to invade, was looking for an excuse to invade Cuba. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, presented a plan to the Secretary of Defense, who in turn passed it on to JFK. It was called Operation Northwoods. And what it called for was a series of false flag events, including terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, an attack on a U.S. ship in open waters, attacking Guantanamo Bay, the U.S. facility on Cuba, and blaming it all on Fidel Castro so they could invade the country. But the big false flag that they were planning on using was taking an empty military or civilian aircraft and remotely guide it over Cuba and blow it up and say, Cuba, Castro shot the airplane down as an excuse to invade. And Kennedy rejected the idea. But this was 1962, 39 years before 9/11. They're already talking about using remote controlled airplanes as a false flag to invade a foreign country. Does this sound familiar?
Wow.
Now, if you jump to 1984, NASA and the FAA conducted a joint crash test experiment in a remote location where they took a big 4-engine commercial jet aircraft, a Boeing 720, loaded it up with crash dummies and cameras to test. They wanted to test crew and passenger survivability in the event of a crash landing. And they took this airplane off by remote control, flew it around the pattern several times before they intentionally crash landed. We got another short film clip on our website about that. But that was 19 years before 9/11. Now, if you jump ahead to early to mid 1990s, that's where we say this uninterruptible autopilot was developed and produced. Actually, these systems over many decades were being developed, okay? And they fine-tuned it coming into 9/11. Now, there's actually a Wikipedia article, if you don't want to believe Wikipedia because it's CIA controlled, but there's an article that's entitled Boeing Honeywell Uninterruptible Autopilot. And it states the stated design purpose is to prevent would-be hijackers from commandeering a commercial jet aircraft by remotely taking control of it and flying it to one of several airports in the world to auto-land it. So the article is somewhat misleading. And they're saying it's an anti-hijacking device, and they're saying it wasn't patented until 2006. Well, someone stumbling across this article would say, hey, look, they've developed an anti-hijacking system as a result of what happened on 9/11. But we've had witnesses who have come forward with testimony from Boeing, Raytheon, the civilian sector, and the military sector who attest to this fact that this system was in fact produced and on airplanes as early as 1996 and 5 years before 9/11. And I'll get into Hani Hanjour here in a minute and explain to you why we believe this airplane wasn't used as an anti-hijacking system, but one to drive airplanes into buildings or to fly them somewhere else. So talking about Hani Hanjour, he was a 29-year-old Saudi Arabian hijacker that came to the States in the mid-90s to take flight training in light airplanes. And it's well documented that he was a very poor student. New York Times, Chicago Tribune, ABC News, and other news outlets all reported this at the time. And he went back to Saudi Arabia only to return to the States just prior to 9/11 and try to re-enroll in a school he had attended before, and they wouldn't take him because he was such a poor student. They didn't want to waste assets on him.
Hmm.
So let's talk about American 77 that hit the Pentagon. It took off from Washington Dulles Airport heading for the West Coast. Had about 50 people on board, I believe, and got to cruise altitude for a while. And then it made an about face U-turn into Washington, excuse me, and started its descent. And at 7,000 feet, the airplane commences this descending, accelerating corkscrew turn. That wasn't the difficult part of the maneuver. The plane arrived precisely at the surface, a few feet off the ground at 500 miles an hour without skidding the surface. It hit the Office of Naval Intelligence on its first attempt. And yet we've been led to believe Connie Hanger completed this maneuver. Now there's another group, grassroots, that doesn't exist anymore. It's called Pilots for 9/11 Truth. They rented a simulator and replicated this maneuver and flown by highly experienced pilots who had crashed the simulator attempting to accomplish this maneuver. But
Hmm.
the story gets better. Hanger goes to the Freeway Airport in Bowie, Maryland. This is 1 month prior to 9/11. And he wants to rent a single engine, propeller driven Cessna 172. Now, when you show up in an airport, they don't just throw the keys to you and say, have
Yeah,
fun.
here you go.
If they don't know you, you got to go up on an evaluation flight and prove you
Yeah.
can fly. Well, Hanger didn't go up on one flight. He went up on 3 flights over a 2-day period with an instructor named Ben Conner and a woman named Sheila Baxter. Okay. They go to the chief pilot, a guy named Marcel Bernard, who I actually it took me a while to track him down, but I spoke to him on the phone. He confirmed this story. And they said, don't rent him an airplane. He can't handle it. And he didn't. He refused rental. So what did Hanger do? He goes down the road 3 days later to another fixed base operator called Congressional Air Charters and wants to rent an airplane. And he goes up with a pilot named Eddie Shalev, who came back from the flight and said, yeah, he's a good pilot. Now, the FBI sent agents out, as did the 9/11 Commission, sent a staffer out and interviewed all these pilots, the three at Freeway Airport and Eddie Shalev at Congressional Air Charter. And what appeared in the 9/11 Commission final report, only as an end note, he didn't testify under oath, he wasn't vetted, was Eddie Shalev's testimony that he was a good pilot, and Eddie Shalev's name appeared only one time. So the FBI and the 9/11 Commission heard both sides of the story, and they went with Shalev's story. Now, who was Eddie Shalev? He was an Israeli that came to the United States just prior to 9/11, contracted out with Congressional Air Charters. So they took the word of this foreign pilot that they didn't know anything about over these three other pilots. So we're claiming that the FBI and the 9/11 Commission totally suppressed this story. And
Mm.
the 9/11 Commission actually came out and said of the hijackers that flew the airplanes, Hani Hanger was the most qualified. They made that statement. Now, what does that say about the other hijackers? So we say because Hanger couldn't have flown the profile because he couldn't fly an airplane, something hit the Pentagon. And if it was the American 77, it couldn't have been flown by Hani Hanger, and the other hijackers were supposed to be just musclemen, no flight training at all.
Right.
So
Do you know much about the profiles of the other pilots? Because
the profiles of
there was three planes altogether. Is that right or not?
there were 4 planes. One crashed in Pennsylvania that we don't
That's
even
right.
address,
Yeah. Okay.
right? But
So do you know the profiles
other,
of the other pilots at all, or just the what's his name, Hani Andra, that you mentioned before?
well, they all came to the States and took flight training, and we contend that the Saudi Arabians, the CIA, and FBI recruited these pilots, brought them in, put them through schools, just to establish a paper trail to justify, to prove that they were qualified pilots to fly these aircraft. But yeah, Muhammad Atta was a ringleader. He was, I think, 37 years old, and he flew American 11 into the North Tower, the first plane to hit. And you can say, well, that's just pointing the airplane going into the building. Well, I'll get back to that in a minute. But this guy, 23-year-old, I can't think of his name right now. It's not important. He was from the UAE. He flew United 175 into the South Tower. And if you look at that profile, 12 seconds out, the aircraft rolls into a 20-degree angle of bank at precisely the correct time to strike the target dead on its first attempt. All three of these airplanes hit their targets on their first attempt, flown by
Yeah.
these inexperienced pilots. So I got to point out that the navigation system on today's commercial jet aircraft is derived from cruise missile technology and is extremely accurate to within a couple meters. So that's why we're saying the pilots couldn't have flown it in the
Could have done
uninterrupted
it.
autopilot.
Can you explain to me in a layman's term, as someone who knows almost nothing about aviation, how, when you explain these maneuvers, can you give me, yeah, like a very dumbed down example of how difficult it would be for an inexperienced pilot to navigate, or even an experienced pilot to navigate the same trajectory as these planes took?
Well, if you look at the twin towers, they were 208 feet wide, and the wingspan of a 767 is like 156 feet. So there wasn't much room for error to hit these buildings, and yet they hit them dead on. And we say, but at that speed, at that closure rate, had they only been several degrees off heading, they would have missed the buildings entirely. And we've talked to experienced pilots in particular. I interviewed on these pilot interviews a couple of Pakistan Air Force fighter pilots that have flown every airplane under the sun. And they said, Dan, you don't get in an airplane and be proficient at flying in on a target without practice. And these guys had none. It's virtually impossible for them to have done it. And if you look at the degree of accuracy required, we always use this example. Suppose you had just gotten your license and drove the family car for around a year, and you hopped into a huge semi-tractor trailer, an 18-wheeler, get it up to a very high speed and try to drive it through a garage without scraping the sides of the truck. That's how accurate they would have been. Or getting into a Formula One race car you never driven and fly it. It's just the handling speed of a 100-ton aircraft compared to the 1-ton airplane that they had trained in, okay? The speed, the complexity of the cockpits involved, we're just saying it was totally impossible these pilots flew those airplanes.
Yeah, wow. So if I can just throw a spanner in the works with these other theories of what could have happened, because from my recollection and some of the videos that I've watched in recent times, there's the theory that there wasn't actually a plane and it was a hologram of some sorts, because I think the evidence of the wreckage and all those sorts of things was almost like non-existent. So is that something that you've been able to debunk to the degree that satisfies, anyone who might be thinking that perhaps there wasn't any plane involved in the first place?
Well, I get attacked by that on social media if I just mention the word plane. Okay. Also, people claim that a cruise missile hit the Pentagon, that there was no wreckage, there was no body parts, the hole was too small, et cetera, et cetera. We're not discounting either one of those possibilities. I'll take you back to the purpose of our organization was only to show the hijackers couldn't have flown the airplane, but the uninterruptible autopilot could, and leave it at that. But I'll back up and say, which I normally don't even address or debate these issues, is that if holograms were used, what happened to American 11 and United 175? The airplanes would pass. Well, there's some people that believe that the aircraft were swapped out with military-grade airplanes over Stewart Air Force Base because both aircraft flight path flew directly over Stewart, and that these beefed up military aircraft painted to look like American and United airplanes actually flew into the Twin Towers. And the same would go with American 77 that hit the Pentagon. If a cruise missile hit the Pentagon, where did it go? So that I leave it at that. We're really attacking the official narrative about the hijackers. and we
Yeah, I
don't
was going
go
to
there.
say some of the other things, like you do get far into the weeds in terms of any possibilities that would rule out that there was actually a plane involved. Because I remember seeing some footage, I think it was with respect to the Pentagon, where there was like a live feed from CNN or one of the news feeds, and the news reporter on one end was saying, we heard that the Pentagon had been attacked and there was some damage there, and he was like, "Oh, I don't see any sort of damage from my end. I've got a really good view, and there's nothing, to my knowledge, that's here." And then, sort of, I don't know, minutes later, that sort of all got scrapped, and all of a sudden, there was some damage done to the building. So people were saying maybe it was targeted by a missile or anything like that. And I guess so. What you're saying is you can't really prove or disprove perhaps that anything
Right.
of that nature was happening, but what you can prove, um, is that based on your experience as a pilot, that there's these three goons who were just sort of trained 2 weeks ago to fly planes, so to speak, could not have flown into these buildings with such a degree of accuracy and cause so much damage in with their little experience. Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, yeah. I've seen the film you're talking about. As a matter of fact, I just did a program where they showed it was unredacted. He showed that film clip of that reporter at the scene
Mm-hmm.
making those statements. So I told you that we only deal with conspiracy facts, and those are theories and beliefs. And I've seen all the evidence that they produce on both of these instances, and we just don't go there
Right.
because where did we go with our information? 3 years ago, our organization started a letter writing, emailing, and making unreturned phone calls to every relevant level and branch of the U.S. government, saying, "Hey, we believe this uninterruptible autopilot was used on 9/11, and we wanted to investigate it." And we don't just mention the 9/11 aircraft. You can get into Malaysia Air 370, Malaysia Air 17,
Mm-hmm.
Metrojet that crashed over Russia, a number of other accidents that we suspected it was employed, and we got stonewalled for 3 years.
Yeah.
We
Wow.
went to the president, the director of national intelligence, the attorney general, assistant attorney general, criminal division, the FBI director, the secretary of transportation, and the FAA administrator. And the only phone call I was able to get through was with a senior attorney at the FAA who said to me, "You haven't proven the uninterruptible autopilot was employed on 9/11." I said, "Yes, but we've shown that it was impossible for Honey Hanger to have flown the airplane, and yet something struck the Pentagon. How do you explain that?" And there was a long pause on the phone, and he says, "The FAA doesn't conduct criminal investigation. Go to the Department of Justice." So I said,
Wow.
"We've been to them many times." So we tried going to the Department of Justice Inspector General a couple times and saying, "Hey, the DOJ should be investigating this, and they're not. Do something about it." Well, I filed myself a hotline report with that office and tried to make phone calls and can't get through to anybody. So it's a total stonewall job. So when these people get into these arguments on social media about who's right, about what hits the tire, I go, "Okay, so you've got all this evidence, information. Where are you going to take it?" Nobody in the U.S. government's going to do anything about it. And
Mm.
we've actually gone outside the United States. I live in Pakistan, and I'm not hiding out over here. Fell in love with and married a Pakistani 14 years ago, and I've lived here ever since. But I even was trying to get through to the Prime Minister, Imran Khan, and went through the Inter Services Intelligence Agency, and they brought me in for an hour, and we talked about this stuff, and they were going to let me meet the director general and do a documentary, et cetera, et cetera. And then Imran Khan got ousted the next month, and that was the end of that. But we decided that because the Muslim community, the 1.9 billion Muslims living on the planet, have been more harmed than almost any other group of people on the planet Earth, save the next of kin. We thought, well, we'll go to them and present to them our evidence that there were no Muslim hijackers controlling the airplane. And we went to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is in Jeddah, that represents 57 Muslim countries. It's like the United Nations of the Muslim world. And the representatives at this organization are the ministers of foreign affairs for each of these countries. We even went to them with letters saying, look, not only does our organization, but others such as the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, we've all got this evidence that will lay at your feet if you'll establish an international Islamic Commission for 9/11 Inquiry, a Muslim 9/11 Commission. I got through on the phone a few times. I've sent them several letters and emails. They won't budge. So we went to the Muslim World League. We went to the European Muslim League. We went to the Council of Muslim Elders, and nobody will budge on this issue. So why is that the case? Why is that the case? You've got 195 supposedly independent sovereign countries in the world, and not one, well, very few leaders of these countries will step forth. I mean, they're not stupid. They've got the same information we do. They know it's an inside job. Well, you can only, who actually ordered the 9/11 hit, or you can surmise. I believe that there is a global cabal comprised of another number of organizations and individuals that actually ordered this hit to usher in the New World Order. And you can go to the bloodline families, the Jesuits in the Vatican, the Freemasons, the Bilderbergs, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the World Economic Forum, you name it. They actually own the planet and are driving the equation. And they wanted an excuse to go into all these Muslim countries because of something called the Greater Israel Project. Oh,
right. Okay. Can I just pause you for a second? So can
sure.
I surmise that your take on the 9/11 attack was that, do you ever deduce that maybe because of this automatic piloting system that was controlling the planes, do you think that these pilots were basically just add-ins, like they maybe they weren't even on the planes, maybe they
Right.
weren't even there to begin with, they were just, you know, names that were picked out of a hat just because of their Muslim descent. So it was just like a reason to put a bad man on the news each night to say, like, these are the people that are targeting our country, so now we have an excuse to go and invade theirs. Is that kind of what you have deduced from this?
That's not kind of, they were patsies.
Yeah,
They were
yeah,
brought
okay.
into the country as a
Got it.
Muslim. I mean, very shortly, maybe the day of the event, they said, look, we know their names, we know what country they came from, we know where they trained, there's nothing to see here. We've already addressed this, now move on. We're not going to bring any pilots in to contest our story. And
Got it.
that's what happened.
The
They
bad guys are
wanted
dead,
these,
and that's all we need to know.
right,
We've got the country of origin, and let's go get them. So then the purpose of the planes was to obviously have the depiction that they were the ones that were responsible for the bringing down of the towers, right? But then, like,
right.
in my mind, there's too much evidence to suggest that it was anything but a plane crash that brought them down. It was all controlled demolition. Are you obviously on the same page as what I am?
Right, right, exactly. And if you look at it, the Pentagon plane could have been directed into the White House or the Capitol building, but the Pentagon is a military installation, and it enabled the U.S. government to say it was an act of war and launch Operation Enduring Freedom into Afghanistan. Now, you look at that operation, they didn't throw that together in the month of September. They war gamed these things for a year at the Army War College. So they knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew what country they wanted to invade for multiple reasons, and that was Afghanistan. And I contend that when the government came out with the lack of experience of these pilots, had airline pilots who recognized that we were being told lies, shut down the entire airline industry globally, it would have brought the global economy to its knees, and shock and awe in Iraq would have never happened. But they didn't do it.
Yeah, and let's not forget that how much money was missing from the Pentagon, like the week before, the day before they were supposed to meet in Congress to find out who who misplaced the, I don't know, $1.3 trillion or some shit like that. Wasn't
I
this an
was
incredible amount of money?
the day before 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld, then Secretary of Defense, announced that 2.3 trillion
That's
was
right.
missing from the Pentagon that was unaccounted for. And lo and behold, American 77, I said, struck the Office of Naval Intelligence on its first attempt. That housed the Office of Budget Analysts, where 50 analysts were investigating this missing 2.3 trillion, and over 30 of them were killed, and it destroyed
Wow.
the record. Now you say, was that a coincidence? We say it wasn't. And
Yeah.
if you look at who the comptroller was at the Pentagon that was appointed to that position a few months before 9/11, it's a guy named Dov Zakheim, who had been in government since the Reagan administration in some capacity. He's a dual U.S. Israeli citizen. And he owned a company, or he was CEO of a company called System Planning Corporation. And guess what they developed? Remote control technology.
Is that
So yeah, you can tie them all together, but you can't prove it. But he's a highly suspect character. And after he left the Pentagon, which was a couple of years after 9/11, he went to work for Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a CIA front company, and he's now back in Israel. So he he was never brought up before the 9/11 Commission. There was some Philip Zelikow was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission that suppressed this information about Hani Hanjour. So there's a bunch of people that should have been brought up and asked questions, and it'll never happen. So that's
mm.
why we're out here big mouthing all this stuff for people to
Yeah,
listen.
sure. So when I know that was it the Patriot Act that got introduced post 9/11. Um, was that the act that was introduced by Bush or Obama on that post 9/11? I can't remember. Do you know what I'm
It was
talking about?
Bush. It was Bush very shortly after the event. This many-page document was produced and passed by Congress, and it had been written well in advance of 9/11 and stripped Americans of so many rights. It's unbelievable. And that was actually authored by a man named Michael Chertoff. Now, who was Michael Chertoff? He was a dual U.S. Israeli citizen who was appointed as Assistant Attorney General Criminal Division by Bush 3 months prior to 9/11. And he was the one responsible for the cleanup of the debris field at the Twin Towers. And he ordered all this steel to be hauled off to China without getting adequate forensic evidence. He tampered with, he contaminated a crash scene of the biggest crash scene ever committed, crime ever committed on American soil in its history. And he was a dual U.S. Israeli citizen whose supposedly mom was a founding member of Mossad. So uh, I could go on about the connections with Israel, but I strongly suggest people, I haven't read both these books, but there's a book called The Trigger by David Icke, and
Yeah.
another book called Solving 9/11 by Christopher Boland. All all evidence points to Israel's involvement in this situation.
Yeah, I'm interested to explore that if you don't mind, because I'm glad you mentioned Mossad because I mean there's a connection on both sides, and I can't quite join the dots as well as you probably can. So I wouldn't mind speaking to that if you don't mind, because you mentioned just a minute ago about these sort of these controlling elites that kind of rule the world. There's all these three-letter agencies. No one knows who's running the show. They all seem to have a controlling um, degree of influence over everything and anything political, and whatever's advanced through our economies and things like that. They move markets, they persuade political leadership, and all this kind of stuff. They create forever wars, and all of this kind of thing. So yeah, I wouldn't mind getting your take on it actually, to see how you've sort of pieced the pieces of the puzzle together.
Well, if you got to look, I said that I believe, or we believe, that 9/11 was executed to usher in the New World Order, which is one world government, one currency, one capital in Jerusalem of the New World Order, no religion, and depopulation. Okay, that's their agenda, 2050. Okay, but if you look at the invasion of countries in the Middle East. Okay. Shortly after 9/11, General Wesley Clark, a retired NATO commander, was in the Pentagon and was shown plans where the U.S. was going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. Okay, which is what happened. Okay. Now, why did they do that? To realize the goals of the Greater Israel Project. Now, what was that? Well, Israel claims that part of Greater Israel is all lands from the Euphrates River to the Nile. And if you overlay a map of Greater Israel over the Middle East, you'll see it pretty much coincides with the countries they want to invade. Well, we believe that Israel owns and controls every level and branch of the United States government, from the president down to the street level politicians, through AIPAC, the American Israel Political Action Public Affairs Committee, as enforced by the Anti-Defamation League and other organizations. So if you look at the standing ovations that Netanyahu just got at 9/11, it exemplifies what I'm saying here. Israel owns the United States, and at the behest of Israel, the United States and its Western allies were the hired guns to carry out the Greater Israel Project. Now you can tie that into what's going on in the Ukraine. The Ukraine's considered part of Greater Israel. Zelensky even said he wanted to import 6 million Jews into the Ukraine. So it's all tied together. That's what's being played out here, and it's all part of the New World Order plan. And we believe that 9/11, we said that the big boys called in the hit. But we believe that 9/11 was planned and executed by Zionist members of the government of Israel, the United States, the UK, and others, through collusion between Mossad, the CIA, MI6, and others. So we believe those were the actual planners and executioners of the event. Now, we can't prove it, and me saying that could get me whacked, but I've written a book, so if I do get whacked, it's all chronicled there, what happened to me and what we believe in. And we also have produced a documentary called 9/11, The Advent of the Ninth Crusade. You can access that on our website. If you go to videos at the top, there's a drop-down menu that says documentary. And we go through everything we just covered here, including my grounding and the attempted grounding of Phil McConnell. But talking about getting whacked, there was a United Airlines Boeing 767 captain named Philip Marshall, who had written 2 books on 9/11 and was about to publish a 3rd one, when he told his ex-wife and his neighbors he was being threatened. And sometime later, the neighbors found Philip in his California home. The family dog and 2 teenage kids were shot to death, and he had a bullet in his head, and the police deemed it a murder-suicide, that he killed the dog and the kids and turned the gun on himself. And his manuscript was missing from the house. Go figure. And the California Attorney General, who didn't conduct a further investigation into this horrible incident, was at the time this California Attorney General. Her name was Kamala Harris, if that rings a bell.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was sent out as a signal to any other pilot, would-be whistleblower: will kill you if you speak out. So I recognize, as do other people in our organization, that we're at risk saying this stuff. But I told you I'm 75 years old, and I don't need to be doing what I'm doing right now, but I know too much about the lies of 9/11 to remain silent. So here I am.
Yeah. So what do you, it does take a lot of courage, and I guess, in sort of putting this all together, what is your ultimate aim, other than just sort of getting messages out there and getting people to maybe rethink and think critically about how this could have happened, and maybe if we could prevent it all again? I mean, there's a lot of themes that are quite synergistic with what we're currently going through in this climate at the moment, so that this,
Right.
that when we talk about, for example, the the pandemic, you mentioned the war in Ukraine. There's all of these sort of like catalyst events which sort of usher in a new world of control and new sort of policies and governmental clampdowns on our freedoms and our sovereignty, and we can just see like the box is getting smaller and smaller. So with that being said, like, what is your ultimate aim for speaking
Well,
out and for the things that you're doing, or the information you're putting out there, the documentaries and the books?
well, we don't believe there will be another 9/11 commission. The United States will never investigate itself into the greatest crime ever committed on American soil in its history. Uh, my personal goal here is to enlighten 1.9 billion Muslims on the planet that they've been lied to about the Muslim hijackers. But overall, we believe too many people in the world still believe the official story. And we're just trying to enlighten them to the fact that it was a false flag event, that the US government and other governments have lied about what's happening, because there's another false flag right around the corner here. And it's going to be worse than COVID. It's going to be worse than 9/11. And they're going to try to get people to fall for this story. And we're just trying to say, hey, they lie and they're using these false flags to do it. And they're stripping us further of our freedom and driving us further into the new world order. So that's my personal goal.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I'm doing, just recently, I personally decided that I was going to try to find Muslim podcasts, try to get out to this 1.9 billion audience, because we feel that our message that there were no Muslim hijackers as the controls will resonate well with this group of people that's been persecuted based on the lies of 9/11 for 23 years. So that's my game plan, Adrian, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, good on you. I commend you for your courage and the courage that you're displaying to speak out about these things. I know that you've already been through so much in terms of your job and your career and your family, and I know through going through COVID how that can tear people apart, and that was another example of how people can be so divided. And I really feel like the main core message I sense through you is to expose these lies and bring people to a point of unity where they can see that there is a common enemy, and it's not people that have a Muslim background. Like these are
Right.
criminals in suits. They live very free and well-to-do lives, and they are quite happily putting their claws into everyone else's business and controlling the masses. Would you agree?
Right. I'll point out that the Boeing Honeywell uninterruptible autopilot system was not produced by a bin Laden enterprise. It's a very wealthy family, and they did not create this system.
Yeah.
It was created in the United States. So,
Yeah, I hear you. I know you mentioned a bunch of websites, but for those that are listening and want to get a hold of you, want to read more of your literature, watch your documentaries, and read your book, where would they go?
well, to get a hold of me, I said our join us page isn't working right now, but I'm on Twitter with about 70,000 followers and wish I had 700 million. But I'm on Twitter at Dan Hanley 4. If you want to come on there and join me there, and you can message me if you want to ask any more questions or have me on a podcast or whatever. I'm also on Facebook, but it's almost useless because I'm so bad shadow banned. But I'm on there at Dan Hanley. So either way, you can use the messenger service. I just, for the contact us page on the website, I just changed the email address. That's how you reached me, I believe, Adrian.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
yeah, and I'm getting emails from all over the world. I can
Yeah,
barely keep
fantastic.
up with them. So people want to know about it.
Yeah, well, Dan, it's a fascinating story, and I think it's one that will always be raising eyebrows, for many years to come. And I once again want to commend you on your courage and your willingness to speak out. I appreciate you spending your time with me on the show. I know we're sort of hours apart, but you know, every time I email you or message you, you're always responding back. So I really appreciate that. I value your time very much, and perhaps sometime in the future we can circle back and do this again. Okay.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for having me on the program. And let me talk. We've been on here now 15 minutes, which is
Yeah,
about a
that's
half hour
fun.
more than we had planned. But I'm a blabbermouth, and if I'm given the opportunity, I tell the whole story, which I did.
Uh-huh.
So thank you.
Good stuff. My pleasure, mate. All right, it's good to speak to you. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye now.